Feel that sand between your toes? It's time for architecture, coffee, and ink. Hello, this is Hollywood C, and you're listening to Architecture, Coffee, and Ink, a podcast dedicated to introducing concepts, detailing out designs, and tackling the architecture you might not realize the meaning behind. I'm your hostess, and I'm here today to start introducing you to the designs that make you wonder why. So I ask you to brew your coffee, grab your sketchbook and pen, and let's begin. Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to episode 12 from me and my incredibly squeaky chair. I know that this episode comes out before the New Year starts, but please enjoy your celebrations and have a safe and happy New Year. The year is ending fast, and 2022 is looming overhead. Is anybody else a little intimidated about setting new resolutions? Maybe I should just start introducing the podcast with my resolutions, start the phrase, welcome to my resolution, and follow up with, the most important part, or my second point of my resolution, finishing up my thesis and graduating in May. Just kidding, I definitely won't start doing that all year. And I will definitely set more goals and aspirations for the coming year. But I want to hear from you guys. Let's hear both your current goals and those New Year resolutions. Stay safe, everyone, as you celebrate. But also take a moment to reflect on where you've been and decide on where you're going. Before we begin the episode, I just want a disclaimer that next week's episode will be coming out just a little bit late. I will actually be traveling for the new year. So while next week's episode will happen, do not worry, I'm not skipping a week. It'll just be coming out on Thursday at 5 a.m. instead of Tuesday. Otherwise, before we begin, just remember to always check your sources, check your facts, and more importantly, check me. So I know I say pretty much every week that if you gave me 1,000 years, I wouldn't be able to cover the topic. But I feel like this is my new litmus test for that. This is my new level. If it does not pass this level, I can no longer make that phrase. So today we're going to be talking about the pyramids of Meroë. So many of you may have also heard it called the Lost or the Forgotten Pyramids of Meroë, or sometimes even the Forgotten Kingdom. I have heard several different pronunciations of it, especially when I was watching news clips for research. So once again, I mean absolutely no disrespect if I mispronounce the name. The pyramids are actually located in what is currently Sudan, alongside the Nile River. The pyramids are actually part of a larger grouping of pyramids. Actually, you know what? Let's take a moment and break down the history of the region and the kingdoms, and then discuss and describe the pyramids themselves. Let's just take a moment and backtrack, because this is the history that is not as well known. And it's really not until you sit down and listen to it and hear about it in its entirety that you realize just how wonderfully deep this topic is. This topic was actually suggested by my sister, so thanks, Scooby-Doo. But to all of you, my dear listeners, sit back and enjoy the episode. So, the history of the site actually starts way back with the kingdoms of Kush. And yes, please notice I used the plural, as in more than one kingdom. Kush was actually centered around the Nile and was focused within the Nubia region, including Lake Nubia and the Cataract, and the famous city of Khartoum during the 25th dynasty. If you look at a series of maps in history textbooks and online, you will notice that there is a shared border with the ancient Egyptian empire at one point, normally drawn around the Aswan and the First Cataract. If you're not familiar with the region or haven't studied ancient Egypt in school, you may have noticed that if you're looking at just on a map, that it refers to the areas further inland as the upper region, while the areas closer to the Mediterranean are called the lower regions. This is actually in reference to the flow of the Nile, or rather the Niles, again plural. In this case, we're talking about the White Nile, the Blue Nile, the Red Nile, and the Mountain Nile, and all of the other tributaries. We are going to be focusing today on the Kushite heartland, which is a slightly smaller region that includes the city of Meroë, Kerma, and Napata. Our site is actually located in what is now Sudan, so like I said before, so you may have actually heard them referred to as the Sudan pyramids, as they were actually in the news not too long ago, something that we'll be talking about in a little bit. So just kind of keep that on the back of your mind. If it sounds familiar, wait a second before Googling it. The cataracts, just to define them, are the rapids along the river and have been used as important geographical points within both wayfaring and storytelling. For us, it's going to be used to explain how far each part of the Kush kingdom expanded during each part of time. So to orient yourselves, the rapids closest to the Mediterranean Sea is actually the first, while the ones furthest away is the sixth. Basically, the higher the number, the further the rapids are away from the sea. Moving north to south. Within the kingdom, each of the three major cities' capitals rose within a certain time period, and as they rose to power, they are the points of reference that are used most often to distinguish between eras of the kingdom. So this is a bit like what we talked about last episode, where the locations of the pyramids and the stone cities being built by the Maya changed as the Maya civilization evolved. In that particular case, everything moved from central out to the coast. So to keep it all straight, I will be talking about each city as the reference to each era. Kind of the name of the era. As to be totally honest, this is how the majority of the articles kind of explain the history. First up is Kermet, which was from 2450 BCE to 1450 BCE, and was focused from the first through the fourth cataract. Napata is when the time of conquest is really when it kicked off. While there are records of the Kerma period being called Kush in Egyptian records, so from the neighboring kingdom, I did notice that many of sites also called that previous time pre-Kush. Napata is when the 25th dynasty comes into play that I mentioned earlier. This period was largely from 1550 to 1070 BCE and was a time full of exchange and interactions with their northern neighbors, those that we just mentioned, the Egyptians. The 25th dynasty actually refers to the 25th dynasty of Egypt, which was actually full of Kush pharaohs ruling, starting with Pive, spelt Piye. Despite the kingdom expanding basically to the Mediterranean at this point, culturally there was two distinctive identities. There was a lot of sharing of ideas and information, but a later invasion of other forces resulted in the deliberate erasure of Kush influences. Many works of art, history, etc. were later destroyed by both the Assyrian and Egyptians who later ruled after the 25th dynasty. This is an unfortunate trend, as many of you history buffs may have caught the date and realized that this would have been after the late pharaoh Hatshepsut was attempted to be removed from the history books by her/their successor Thutmose in a quest to strengthen Thutmose's own rule. However, the treatment was much the same, removing of the names, defacing the statues, the histories, etc. So the final kingdom city region was Meroë, which, as you may have guessed, was heavily influenced by everything that came before it and the people and cultures that were intertwined within and around it during the whole of the previous kingdoms of Kush. This period was from 300 BCE through 4 CE, but the impacts of it echoed to today, including the main topic of today's episode, the pyramids themselves. As you may have inferred, the Meroë pyramids were heavily influenced by the Egyptians' pyramids. However, the Egyptians were already building them by the time that they were incorporated into the Kush. That being said, the sheer number of pyramids being built and the changes to the designs truly caused the Meroë pyramids to stand out. While admittedly smaller in size, they had steeper roofs, but it allowed for the multitude of them to be built. The whole of Meroë was abandoned around 350 CE. If you ever get the chance to learn more about them and their culture, please do. I know that my primary school focused more on ancient Egypt, Rome, and Greece, but they actually had an amazing trade, crafts, and culture that I unfortunately just won't have the time in this episode to cover. But if you do want to learn more and don't know where to start, please check out either the blog page or reach out to me directly, and I'll be happy to steer you in a few places. But you may have noticed that within my history summary, I attributed the original idea of pyramids, or more the use of pyramids as burial, to the ancient Egyptians, with the 25th dynasty serving as the moment the exchange of ideas between the two kingdoms occurred, which would have been the moment that the Meroë would have started building pyramids. However, in 2017, a member of the Sudan government actually claimed that the Kush came first and were the first to utilize the pyramids. His argument was based on the Quran, particularly using the Book of Exodus as his proof, while another group actually uses the Meroëtic stele to argue that the Meroë pyramids came first. Another point that was argued is that this is one of Bible's sons was actually mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as an ally for another. My problem with these arguments comes down to the fact that they really just come down to a translation issue. If you wanted to sum up the entirety of everything that I just said, or even that I didn't say about the arguments, they're really arguing that there's some sort of translation issue, that there's a lot of flexibility, or no, that's the wrong word. It's more of a debate on the use and translation of key words. So, without agreement from everybody for both of those arguments, I just chose to share the history the way the majority of the evidence and carbon dating suggest, and the way most of the articles and sources I read presented it. There is, to be fair, a rather famous series of mistranslations that have occurred throughout the years, including the phrase helpmate that changed a lot of history, or at least a lot of the way we look at history. So I will never speak in absolutes about any topic, as there's always room to learn more. Overall, a lot of the history and a lot of the interest and study in around the Nubia area is really focused on the Egyptians. As I stated in the very beginning, this is called a lost or forgotten site. It wouldn't be called that without good reason. So keep that in mind if you ever research the topic more on your own. It also has been called an assortment of other names, each changing slightly based off the frame of reference it came from. Some other names for the region are Ta Seti, Ta Neshesi, Nubia, Kush with a C, and Kush with a K. But now, with the history of the Kingdom of Kush out of the way, let's focus on the pyramids themselves. So the Meroë pyramids are actually a very specific set of what is now ruined, and is considered to be part of the greater Nubian pyramid whole. Remember, I mentioned earlier that while I and others address each period by the capital, the whole region is actually much larger than a single city. According to the UNESCO website, the official protected zone is called the Archaeological Sites of the Island of Meroë, and was in power from 8 BC to 4 CE. But it wasn't until the 3 BCE that the site started serving as a burial ground for royalty. Unlike the Egyptian pyramids, these actually had the burial chambers beneath the pyramid. Due to the changes in the environment, they were a mixture of granite and sandstone. Our particular site is actually broken up into 3 major cemeteries: the South, North, and West cemeteries. Sudan as a whole is reported to have roughly 2 to 3 times the number of pyramids as Egypt, while overall there are several hundred pyramids and buildings throughout the region. Wikipedia has the most concise summary of buildings per cemetery. To be honest, I really ignored the rest of the article. It really wasn't helpful to my research at all, but it does help with the maps and a rough estimate of what each cemetery has. So the West Cemetery is the easiest. It has 113 tombs, no royalty. North has 44 tombs, and the South has 204 tombs roughly. Of the 3, the North and the South have a mixture of classes between royalty and upper class, while the West is the only one without any royalty, as I mentioned before. However, and this is a huge however, once there was a switch in the primary language from Egyptian to Kush, a notable issue in the clarity seemed to have arose. Several articles mentioned it offhand, like almost an aside, that once they changed the primary scripts being used, we as a modern society don't understand it. So we're having an issue with understanding what they're saying, which to me should have been a much larger point, especially given that we know for a fact that there was a period of time where records were being actively destroyed and records changed. But this is probably why I'm not an archaeologist, because I would write a book or make an episode of a Discovery or History Channel show solely dedicated to arguing the validity of sources. And let's be honest, no one needs that level of paranoia in their lives on the regular. But the pyramids and who is housed in them actually tells us a lot about the importance in the hierarchy. So, queens were actually housed and clearly denoted as important, and many tombs had the remains of people, possessions, jewelry, and everything that would/could be needed for an enriched afterlife. Overall, the site is situated roughly a mile from the Nile. Unfortunately, we have reached the part of the tale that is always the worst part to talk about. Due to the accessibility of the site, i.e., it was very accessible, it was robbed multiple times. While yes, the site and later studies did recover artifacts, and they still found things, weapons, etc., the truth is that the site was likely raided multiple times over the years, including one of, if not the most famous, by Giuseppe Ferlini, who blew the tops off of several of the pyramids in the quest for treasure. He is in a series of articles dubbing him the quote pyramid destroyer, quote pyramid thief, etc., and is a good example of why I always Google figures' names plus conspiracy before talking about them. Overall, he destroyed over 40 of the pyramids, starting in 1834. But several other Europeans and other explorers were credited with having seen them before that, or with published books on the subject. The difference is he used dynamite, and he sold whatever artifacts survived the explosion to the highest bidder, including the history of many of the more famous queens. Eventually, historians stepped in. Among the most notable, including people from Harvard University, Boston, and the Windsor expedition that yielded the connection between the Kush, Greece, and the Romans. All in all, while this site is open to the public, it is a hidden gem among the UNESCO sites, and is one that was recently threatened with both storm damage and flooding. Also, vandalism, and much, much more. The necropolis was placed under the protection of UNESCO in 2003 and is also part of the Antiquities Protection Ordinance of 1905 and is managed by the National Corporation of Antiquities and Museums. If you are interested, check out the references I will be posting on the blog later today. I include the UNESCO site, which has several of the management plans available to read, and see how they are planning to move the site forward. Overall, I wish I had 3 more hours to talk about their cultures and religions, and to describe some of the symbolism and images. But we really have run out of time this week. This is definitely one of the episodes where I really could have gotten lost in a rabbit hole, like I said at the beginning. Rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and just spent hours talking about the information available. And more importantly, what isn't. But thank you for tuning in. And as always, once again, a big thank you to all my listeners. I know I say this every week, but please rate and review. Share with your friends, neighbors, your family, your professor, whomever you think needs some architecture in their lives. It really does help the show, and the more listeners, the more I can do. Please tell everyone, or tell me what I suck at. If you want more episodes or longer ones or shorter, just let me know. We again have a Facebook page and private group, both of which are under the same name. architecture, coffee, and ink. The answer to the question for the private group is who the host is Hollywood, just like the city. And a second question is just your opinion, and I might just use it as a recommendation for a show with a little shout out. If you want to either be featured or have a case study suggestion, or just want to share a story of your favorite designer experience, you can find me at Architecture Coffee and Ink. The website is architectureinc.design.blog. Insta is now Architecture Coffee and Ink, as well as the new TikTok. Everything will be linked in the show notes. You can also email me at that@gmail.com, all spelled out without the ampersands or commas, and not the word that@gmail. I'm sorry, at architecturecoffeeandink@gmail.com. Again, I started a TikTok under Architecture Coffee and Ink as well, and I have a few ideas on how I'll be setting forward with that once the new year starts. But until then, have a wonderful new year. And as always, may your coffee mugs be full and your ink wells never run dry. See you next year, everybody.